Yay! It is, oh gracious, it's June 14th. I know someone who's having a birthday today. Anyway, so today I wanted to talk a little bit about Scott's last week. And so I have some pretty fun things I want to talk to you about today. And these are some of the things that I have been talking to people about. So if you have had coffee with me or visited with me, you've probably heard me tell these stories, but I'm going to try and get lots of the stories in one bit today because sometimes when we think about dying week, it's very somber. There's lots of sadness. There's lots of tears. There's just like all the physical stuff that happens, and it can seem like, oh gracious, death is so heavy, and it is. But God is gracious to us, and many people I have learned have experiences in the last week or like in dying weeks or dying days as they come up to them, if they have that kind of time, that completely like lighten the mood, that change things. And in my case, I want to say that I actually think that Scott was having glimpses of heaven. So let me just tell you a little bit about like a couple things that happened. So one of the things is that as one thing that had never happened before is that he started having some like hallucinations or something weird was happening, and he wasn't even on a lot of medication. So I don't really know where it was coming from, except that it was his brain, and he was dying, and I'm not really sure what all was happening. But so one really funny one was, and go ahead and laugh. I know we're talking about what happened to Scott in his dying week, but you know what? I think God gave us these moments so that we could laugh and also see Scott's heart. Okay, so it'd been a rough kind of day, but it was I think it was about Tuesday, and I was exhausted, but he wanted to sit up. And so but he couldn't sit up on his own. So we, like, between my mom and I, we got him sitting up. I was leaning on the bed rail so that I wouldn't topple over. And I had my arm around him, and he was like all his weight leaning on me. And he was wrapped in a sheet, and he's like leaning forward and kind of hunched over. And he had lost so much weight. So he's like so tiny, and he's just like whatever. And his head is bowed over, and he wasn't opening his eyes a lot yet at that point because he was just so tired. We did open them at one point, but my mom had been puttering around in the room, cleaning up this and cleaning up that, and so I was just sitting there, and then all holding him because he wanted to sit, and then all of a sudden my mom left the room. She was done puttering, so she left the room. So as soon as my mom left the room, he's like, "Hey, what are we gonna do now? What do you want to do now?" And I'm like, "Oh." And the way he said it with such mischief in his voice, I was like, "What are you talking about?" Because this sounded like he was going to be up to something. And I'm like, "You do not have energy for all the things that I'm thinking you might be thinking." And so I was like, "Well, what do you mean?" And he's like, "Well, what are we going to do now?" And I said, "Well, like, with what?" And he's like, "Well, with the money." And so we had sold his house, and so I was like, "Do you mean like with the money from the house?" And he looked at me like I was like, "Come on, where have you been all this time?" And he said, "Well, no, the money we stole." So I'm like, "We stole money?" "Yeah." "Where did we steal money from, Scott?" And he like ducked his head in real quiet, and he whispered, and he's like, "From the US." And I'm like, "We stole money from the US?" "Yes." "Why did we steal money?" And he lifted his head and he looked at me like I was a complete moron. And he says to me, "To give to the poor, of course." And I'm like, "Okay." So I, like, not knowing what to do, trying to hold back my laughter. I'm holding him here, and I don't want, like, I'm trying not to shake because I'm trying not to laugh. Because clearly we did not steal money from the US to give to the poor. Although that might be a great idea. I don't know, but whatever. So with that, like I'm holding him and he's like dead serious that we stole this money from the US and who do I think I am that I forgot that we are going to give this to the poor? So I saw my mom coming out of the bathroom, like, hey, mom, come quick, we need you. My mom comes running into the room. She's like, what? What happened? I'm like, Scott and I stole money from the US and we need to give it to the poor right away. She looks at him, she looks at me, she grabbed a candle that was on the like little nightstand thing that I have in my room. She grabbed this candle. I got it. And she rattled, roll. I'll take care of it right away. I've got it under control. So I'm holding him and I'm like, okay, mom's taking care of it. She'll make sure that the poor get the money. Oh, good. Now I think I need a nap. And I laid him down and he went to sleep. And we have laughed about that because it's just like out of the blue. Like, first of all, Scott has such a soft conscience. There's no way he would steal a paper clip from anywhere. Like, he just wouldn't, and much less money from the US. But his heart, like, we did it so that we could give money to the poor. It was like such a sweet thing. So it was really, really funny. He was playing hockey with my mom at one point, although he doesn't know that he wasn't running to go get the puck, and neither was my mom. But he saw a puck, and he was playing hockey with her, and those were times that he was like engaging with us, but he wasn't really opening his eyes very much. Although he did open his eyes when he looked at me in shock that I didn't know we were going to give this money to the poor. But most of the other times, actually, Scott was not opening his eyes. So if he was having a hallucination, he wasn't opening his eyes. There was one point where he fell in the bathroom, and like it was actually terrible. It was actually tragic. So he'd managed to get to the bathroom, and it was just very complicated. He didn't even have really the energy to stand up or walk. So I don't actually know how he made it to the bathroom, except he had his walker and he was banging on and leaning on furniture. And the way he had done it, I couldn't get to him fast enough because he had locked his walker and was like getting behind it. So it was in the way. And anyway, I did finally manage to unlock his walker and get around. But by that point, he was standing in front of the toilet. We had a toilet frame, and he fell against the wall. Okay, again, this is not the funny part. So he fell against the wall. He did get hurt later. We saw he had bruises, but he fell against the wall. But then when he fell against the wall, he also fell backwards. Now, like I said, he'd lost a lot of weight. So his leg, his thigh fit, which is very tiny, like it's probably smaller than my arm. But anyway, his leg fit between the wall and the arm of the toilet frame. And so he fell in between there. So one leg is on one side of the toilet frame and one leg goes on the other side of the toilet frame. And he has now fallen backwards. And I got to the toilet just barely in time to catch him, because I could just see, like, oh my goodness, he's perched sitting on top of this toilet frame arm. So like, just think about like a little itty bitty plastic arm that he's like perching on. And he doesn't have any body strength. Like, at this point, he is not sitting up on his own. I actually, like I said, I have no idea how he got to the bathroom as fast as he did and whatever. It just, I don't know. Something in his adrenaline just said, I need to use a bathroom and I'm going to do it. Anyway, so he's perched up on this toilet frame, and I can see that he is going to fall in toward the toilet. So I am trying to straddle this toilet, which has a frame on it. And so I can't get as close as I'd like. And I'm twisting my body so that I can reach in. And sure enough, he falls inward onto the thing. But just as he does it, he attempts to lift his hands and says, I'm riding a horse. And he was on this toilet frame arm, and he was convinced he was riding a horse. So I finally did get him. I caught him, but then I had to like lift him back up onto this horse. And then I had to bring him forward off of the frame. So he fell onto my body, which was like a dead weight, because it was like all of his weight. And then I was able to set him down into the toilet. And then I had to call for help to get him off. But Because two of us had a hard time getting him off and back to bed. So I don't know how he got there on his own. Like it's just whatever, some strange things happen. But anyway, he remembered. So later on that morning, I was talking to the nurse about we needed to make some changes and get a catheter inserted and whatever, everything going because I did not want another episode. And he's like, tell her I rode a horse this morning. So I told her, and I don't know. Like, I don't know if he thought he was actually riding a horse or if he was with it enough to be making a joke. I really don't know. But it was hilarious. And so those are some funny things that happened. Another funny thing was um, one of our pastors, Vince, came to pray with him. And so Scott was in bed again, not opening his eyes. So he's just like recognizing people by voice. Now the doctor had changed. We had had a change of doctor in there. And so we went from Dr. Breimer to Dr. Welk. But I did not tell Scott because Scott was like really not with it very much at the time. He was in and out. And when he was with it, then telling him who the doctor was the least of my concerns. What I wanted to do was talk to him about where he was going, wanted to talk to him about how much he was loved, who was in the room. I wanted to give him opportunity to say things that need to be said. We were not concerned about like what's happening with the doctor. Okay. So I had not told them. But anyway, so he's laying in the bed, eyes closed, and Pastor Vince comes in to the room and stands at the head of the bed and says something like, hey, Scott, how are you doing today? And and Scott says, oh, it's Dr. Welk. And I'm like, how do you know about Dr. Welk? Because Dr. Welk is your daughter. How did you know? He's like, oh, no, Dr. Welk's not my doctor. Dr. Welk was Rhonda's doctor for many, many years. He is an amazing doctor. He's such a good doctor. And so I was like, oh, well, he is your doctor now. And he's like, oh, well, then I'm in good hands. And it was just very sweet. So I knew he was with it at that point because he remembered who Rhonda's doctor had been, and he was very glad to have Dr. Welk at as his doctor. And then I said, but this is Vince. Vince is here to see you. And so Vince is the one who's come. It's not Dr. Welk, it's Vince. And he's like, oh, Vince. And he just like began by praying a blessing for Vince, and then they visited for a bit, and then Vince prayed for Scott, and then Vince was saying he had to leave. And so, if you know Scott, you just know he was always talking with the Lord. He was a man of prayer. Like every conversation would turn into prayer, usually, at least between him and I. And he was always there to bless others, and he's always thinking about others, always serving others. If you know the Enneagram, he's a type 2, but boy, he had a servant heart like his father God. And so anyway, he just is a sweet kind of guy that way. And so right near the end of the visit, Vince has already said he's going to be going. And Scott says to me, help me sit up. And so I'm like, oh, brother. So I got his arms around my neck and I gave him this big bear hug and I sat him up. Again, he could not sit on his own. So I wasn't entirely sure why it was urgent but he felt it was important. So, okay, I helped him sit up. And as I'm doing this, he had speech at this point, was very quiet. And so he's speaking into my ear. He's like, go get my wallet. And I'm thinking to myself, first of all, I have not seen your wallet in a few days. I don't know where your wallet is. So I'm like, what do you need from your wallet? And then out loud, he says, we need to bless this man before he goes. I want to bless this man before he goes. So, okay. So I get him all sitting up, and so we're sitting up, and Vince is leaning in real close so that he can hear. And I'm leaning in real close so I can hear. And we're just waiting for this blessing that Scott wants to give to Vince before he leaves. And we're like, okay, how do you want to bless Vince? And he says, without opening his eyes, he's like, pay for his taxi. So I'm like, Absolutely. I will pay for his taxi. And then I put him back down to bed. And we walked out of the room before we chuckled. Because of course there's no taxi. And Vince came in his own vehicle, so I didn't need. So I said, "Do you need gas money?" Because Scott would have me give you gas. He's like, "No, it's okay." But anyway, when we were getting ready for the funeral, Vince shared with the family how like he'd felt so like, oh, I'm gonna get this big blessing. We were both like waiting just on like with bated breath. What are these words gonna be? Pay for his taxi. Anyway, we thought that was hilarious. We don't know where that came from. We believe that would have been a like a hallucination or something where he just wasn't thinking right, but we're not sure where that came from because he never lived in a place where his mode of transportation or it would have been normal for people that he would have been visiting with um to give him or to arrive by taxi or to pay taxi fares, but whatever. So those are some of the funny ones. But there were other ones that were entirely different. The hallucination ones, we could kind of tell he was more present. He was like it was more like I don't know how what to say. Like he often wasn't opening his eyes. He was talking. It was a little bit crazy, and it was very earthly. Like it was very much about what was happening right here. So about stealing money and playing hockey where he thought he was seeing a hockey puck or whatever there by the bathtub there you see it kind of stuff like that. So it's very natural, it's very here on earth. But then he began to talk about some other things, and it actually took me a couple of conversations of his to actually and probably the Holy Spirit was like sharpening my spirit, his spirit within me to notice and to hear what it was he was talking about. Now, some of you may not believe that you can see heaven, that you kind of walk back and forth, but I think you can. And there are many, many, many scientifically documented stories of people who've had near-death experiences or who have been pronounced dead and then come back to life, who have seen heaven, both heaven and hell, actually. So there are documents of both. So so I think that it's fair to say that we do see these things. And if we read scripture and we see what heaven is actually going to be like, these things start to make sense, and they flow, they make sense. They don't even contradict scripture. So it makes sense. Anyway, so let me tell you about these. And if you have questions about it, I would love to hear some of your questions. Or if you have been with a loved one who, as they have been passing, have seen heaven, or maybe they have seen loved ones or are having conversations with loved ones who have already gone on ahead. I would love to hear that. I find those things so encouraging because we do not talk enough about heaven, and heaven is actually amazing. And if we actually could grasp it, we wouldn't want to stay here. So I think that's why maybe we don't know more about heaven, is because God has a job for us here to do. But he wants us to know enough so that we can be excited about it. Okay, so the first thing that Scott said that made me wonder, well, actually, I didn't even notice it. It was my daughter who was in the room. And I do want to say that many of the conversations that Scott and I had in the last day, or last week, I should say, my daughter did record them, and I won't share them here because for me they're too personal. They're our private moments that I use to remember and be encouraged. But I will share some of the things that he said, not all of them, but some of them, because I think that we all need to hear some of these things so you know where he's gone, but also so you know what your future could be if you are a believer of Jesus. If you're in relationship with Jesus, this is where you would go. So she was actually in the room. We were never more than less than two people in the room with Scott because of the demands that his health needed. We needed to just have two people there. It was just that way. But one day he was like, look at these stairs. They're not finished yet. And he was like, almost indignant, like they're not finished yet. And again, he did have his eyes open here. And this is one of the things that I did notice, is that often when he was seeing heaven, his eyes would be open. He wasn't seeing anything here, like there was nothing there, but he was seeing heaven. And so these stairs were not complete, they weren't ready yet. And I'm like, oh, well, what color are the stairs? And he's like, ugly brown. And I'm like, oh, that's weird. And why is it important that the stairs are not done yet? And so my daughter, who's in the room, said to me, Mom, do you think he's seeing heaven, and maybe heaven's not ready for him? Like it's not his time yet? And I'm like, oh, maybe. It wasn't too much later that again, he was asking to be sitting up. He wanted to sit up in a chair. Again, couldn't sit on his own. So we put him in a chair, we propped him all up, and we got him like so that he wouldn't fall. We pushed him into the sun, and he was like, wow, this is our dream house. As again, eyes wide open, looking at nothing. This is our dream house. He's like, this is beautiful. And I said, oh, like, what is it? He's like, it's a 2-story house. And so he, like, there were some parts where he was mumbling, and then he said, I said, what all is in your house? He's like, well, it's got a soaker tub, of course. And I'm like, oh, cool. And then he said, and it has and the main floor is also the basement. And so I said, like, do you mean like a walkout basement? And he said to me, like, and he was almost like I was like interrupting what he was doing, but he was like just sort of brushing me aside a little bit and saying, well, it's like the one Kent and Dina used to have. And so I was thinking about that because like in the moment I was like, but I think Kent and Dina have one now. So I said, do you mean like the kind they have one that they have right now? And he's like, no, like they used to have. And in that moment I was like, oh, I wonder if he's in a completely different time zone. Like to him, he's already in the future. He's already seeing heaven, and to him, this is the past. So even though Kent and Dina have a walkout basement now, like this is not his present anymore. And I'm like, oh, okay. And then he said, it is so beautiful. This is the most beautiful house. I love seeing our dream house together. Dreaming about this house has been amazing. Thank you. And like, that wasn't even me. It wasn't, I felt like he was telling this to me, but it was like, it wasn't even me. It's like I had been interrupting. And I felt like he was seeing or being like maybe given a tour of his own house that Jesus had made for him. So at the end of that conversation, and the other thing is, Scott and I had never dreamed of any other house. We had never, ever talked about anything other than renovations here in our current home. We had lots of plans for that, and Scott had all kinds of ideas that he wanted to do to make sure that this house would take care of me for a very long time. But we never, ever, ever talked about moving out of here unless it would be to like a seniors complex. We did talk about that. But it would be a condo. It wouldn't be a dream house. So it definitely was nothing that we had ever talked about here. It was completely not our earthly experience. And the way he was talking about it was like, it's like some killer house. Like it's beautiful up there. So then the next time he talked about the house, he was laying in bed and he actually woke me up and it scared me. And he was looking straight up and he's like, wow, those are really nice chairs. And so it kind of woke me up and I'm like, oh, well, what do they look like? So he was looking sort of like, to 45-degree angle this way, laying down, and then he turned his head. He's like, they're exactly like those. And so clearly I have no idea what those look like. But yeah, he was seeing chairs. And then he's like, oh my goodness, those dishes are so beautiful. And I just like, he was just having a tour of his home and everything was so beautiful to him and just exactly how he would have wanted it, including a soaker tub. And if you know Scott, he loved his long bathtubs, and that's why he bought a hot tub. So we had a hot tub here that we used almost every day last winter until he couldn't anymore. And so of course it would make sense that God would have a soaker tub for him in heaven. So it's just like so amazing. Another time he was laying in bed, and it was in the middle of the night, and he said, "Look at those pasture lands." And I was like, "Oh, what do they look like?" And they are so green, so very green. And I'm like, "Well, what's in them?" And he said, "Animals." And I said, "What kind of animal?" Because here on earth, we just put usually one kind of animal in a pasture, and we put a different kind of animal in a different place. And he said, "Every kind of animal. This is amazing." Like, and he was just floored by the green and all the animals together and how amazing these pasture lands were. So that was pretty incredible. Again, Ari and I were both there, and we were both very aware that he is seeing heaven. And another time, and I don't remember if he used the word lake or water, but he's like, "Look at that beautiful lake." And then he said, "I don't know. Look at those boats. I don't know which boat to get into." And so again, I don't know who he was talking to. Clearly not me, because I made the suggestion, well, if Jesus isn't one of the boats, get into that one. And if Jesus isn't one of the boats, like, try and find Peter, because he used to be a fisherman. He'd probably be pretty good with boats. And but he didn't reply to me. I guess I was just in his way. So he saw a lake for sure with boats. And so I don't know if he took one. Um, and then one other time he said, "Wow, this is gonna be fun." Again, eyes wide open, laying down, and his voice was as animated, like more animated than, like, whenever he talked about heaven and he was exclamatory, he was so animated, more than he was with just normal conversation. And certainly not like he didn't have energy for anything anymore, but these moments he kind of came alive. And so he said, "This is going to be fun." And I said, "Well, what's going to be fun?" And he said, "There's boating and there's basketball." And he listed more. And I wish I had not forgotten all of the activities he mentioned. And he's like, "There's just so many activities." And again, he said, "This is going to be so much fun." And I just felt like where he was seeing and where he'd be going would be full of life. So full of life. He's not going to be bored. It's going to be beautiful beyond comprehension, beyond his wildest imaginations, better than the dream house he could have ever dreamed on his own, or even with my help. Like, it's just going to be beyond what we can imagine, and so full and so fun and so full of life and vibrancy. And I think we forget that when we think about heaven. We're just like, so, oh, we're going to worship. It's just going to be a time of worship, and there's going to be like all these things that we're going to, we're going to sing forever, and we're going to, be in the sanctuary of God, and we're going to do all and we will. Like, I'm not saying we're not going to do all those things. Like, clearly we will worship God, but I think our very being will worship God. I think there's going to be work there that we're going to worship God with. Everything that we do is going to bring worship in. And I've heard, like, people say, recently I was speaking to someone who said, like, "Oh, I didn't think there'd be animals in heaven." Well, I don't know where we got that idea. Like, I guess when maybe some people have been talking to children and a pet dies and, like, "Oh, animals don't go to heaven." Well, maybe animals don't have a soul that gets revived and goes to heaven, but there's definitely going to be animals in heaven. Like, we know that. And so if we don't know that, then it's because we have an overriding belief about heaven that is incorrect, that colors our view of scripture. Because let me ask you, what is Jesus riding in heaven when we talk about the last days when he comes back? He's riding a horse. He's riding a horse. I think there's more than one horse in heaven. There's going to be an army, and there's horses, at least one horse. There's lots. But it also says that there's going to be choice meats. Here's a complicated question for you. How do you get meat if you don't have animals? Meat comes from animals. In heaven, there's going to be banquets where we are going to eat meat. The Bible says so. We will not be vegetarians in heaven because the Bible says we're going to eat choice meats and so, or well-aged meat. So depending on which translation you read, we're going to have some pretty good meat when we get to heaven. And that comes from animals. And it also talks about the lion sleeping with the lamb, and that animals who are preying animals will not eat those who are like domestic animals or whatever you want to call them in heaven. I don't know what they're going to be, but they're going to be able to lie down together. That means there's animals there. We know there's animals there, but we've sort of skimmed over that because we believed that, I don't know. But if you think about the fact that the Garden of Eden is what God created, and every kind of animal was there. Every kind of animal was in the Garden of Eden. And when we go back to heaven, why would God eliminate that huge part of his creation when he brings us to heaven? I don't think he will. He didn't make a mistake with that. He said it was good. So there's going to be animals in heaven. Do you love animals? You're going to love heaven because you're going to be able to be up close and personal with all of them. It's going to be so amazing. And so and just the fact that when Scott saw all of these animals in this amazing pasture land, this makes sense to me that he was seeing heaven. And it also makes sense that all the animals would be together because they won't be fighting each other. They're not each other's dinner. So just interesting, just so interesting. The other thing is that I think right near the last time that we were talking, and this is very personal, so please be patient with me and recognize that this is my story. This was our very intimate conversation that I'm going to share with you. A couple of the things that Scott was really concerned about before he died is that he wouldn't leave me with his personal debt. He wanted his mortgage paid off, his car paid off, and his credit card paid off. He didn't have a lot of debt, but those are the things that he wanted so that I would not be left with his debt. And Scott worked really hard to provide for his family when he was together with Rhonda. But that took all of his energy and his time. He was able to work 2 part-time jobs during those years to care for his kids and his wife, and he did a phenomenal job. And that's one of the reasons I married him, is because of his faithfulness and his love toward Rhonda when it was 17 very, very difficult years, where it was difficult financially for them, where he had to work part-time jobs, where there weren't benefits necessarily at either of the jobs. It wasn't until the last 3 years that he was actually able to get a full-time job. And so Scott did as well as he could with where he was at, but one of his biggest concerns was that he was not debt-free and he didn't want to leave that with me. So I need you to know that part so that you understand this next part. So we sold, his house sold on April 25th. That was the day that began feeling like he would say to me, I'm done. He said to others, I'm done. And at first he thought maybe it was a spiritual attack, but we began realizing that maybe it wasn't a spiritual attack. Maybe it was actually the Holy Spirit saying, okay, now you're ready. The house closed and changed hands on April 28th, which was a Friday. And we got a text from the realtor saying that the new owner was very happy in his new home. And then the very next day, well, actually that evening, he started getting weaker and weaker. So we were going to go out for dinner and he was not strong enough to leave the house. And he never left the house again. So the next day is when he started to throw up, and that was the beginning of the end. So he only lasted 1 more week after the house sold. But of course, the house sold, and then there was still some debt to pay off with what was left of the sale of the home. So clearly he could not do that. So I was able to do that in the first few days of the week. Towards the middle of the week, I was able to take care of the debt for him. I had told him, but he didn't really, I wasn't sure if he actually heard me or if it had sunk in. So it was the last time you spoke. I believe it was Thursday night or Friday, probably Friday early morning. And all of a sudden he said, "I'm not quite ready." Just in the middle of the night. He hasn't talked for a long time. And he said, I'm not ready. And I said to him, I had my arm around him. I was rubbing his head. I said to him, Scott, you are ready. You are ready to go. You've been faithful and you have done everything that you need to do. And all of a sudden I was wondering, I wonder if he's not ready because he thinks the bills aren't paid. So I said to him, you've done well. You were a faithful husband. You were a good husband. You did all these things well. And all of the debt is paid off. I paid off the mortgage, the car, and the credit card. So you're not leaving me any of your debt. So you're in good hands. And so like on the mortgage on his trailer. So I told him this, and then he like settled a little bit. And then I think he saw Rhonda. I think he was in that heavenly space again. Because he said, I really, really want to, but I don't want to offend Carla Ann. And the only thing that I can think of that ever would have been like anything, and it really wasn't a thing between us at all. Would have been whether or not he would go to Rhonda instead of staying with me. And so I said to him, you just go ahead. You go. If you see Rhonda, go, because Rhonda is with Jesus, and that means that you would be going to Jesus, and I'd be happy for you to go to Jesus. And I know you're ready. You are ready to go. You've been faithful. You've been a good husband. My daughter, who was in the room with us, she came over and she put her arm around him and she said, Dad, we'll take really good care of Stuart and Serena, and we'll take very good care of Mom. You can go. He didn't talk again after that. And he was like so peaceful. I think he saw heaven. And I'm glad. I'm glad he saw heaven. Because that means he wasn't scared to go, because it was a good place. And it also was good for me. It was good for the kids, the people who were hearing these things, because it gave us the peace that we knew where he was going. I mean, we knew where he was going anyway, but that it was an exciting place. It was a good place. There was something amazing about heaven, way more amazing than what we have imagined, like some people, movies, they tell us like there's this big light, you just walk into the light, and maybe you do walk into a light, but it's not just light. And we know that there's going to be light because Jesus alone himself, he is the very essence of light. So there's definitely going to be light there, but there's more. And we're not going to be angels on harps on clouds singing all time. No. There's like so many amazing things happening. And if we could compile, and some people have compiled books about what heaven is like, it's actually pretty amazing. And I think that we actually need to start talking about what heaven is really like more and more, like bring it into your everyday conversation. Because you think things are good here. No, you haven't seen color till you've seen heaven. You haven't been fully loved until you get to heaven. There's one more story that I will tell you about. And this is another one that tells me that I believe that he actually experienced being in the presence of Jesus. So Scott is Enneagram type 2. Scott loves words of affirmation. He loves touch. He loves being told how much he's loved. And I think many of us are like that. But those of us who have words of affirmation as one of our love languages, you'll know how important these things are. So at one point I was like stroking his arm and just telling him, Scott, you did a great job. I felt so loved. You were such a good husband to me. You were a good husband to Rhonda. You were such a good dad for Stuart and Serena. You were a good dad for my kids, and you were a really good Saba. They love you so much. You were so faithful. You loved Jesus with your life. You've lived such a testimony. And I was rubbing his arm and telling him, and these are things that normally he would have just soaked up as if this was like life. He just loved words of affirmation. But instead, he pulled his arm away from me and put a grimace on his face, and he said, "Why are you being so pessimistic?" Ari and I both laughed because I certainly wasn't being pessimistic. But I think what happened is my words of love and my words of affirmation and my words of encouragement that were meant to fill him up were so like nothing. They were awful in comparison to the love and the love he had already experienced being in the presence of Jesus. Like this just felt yucky to him. And he just wanted to be where like it was real love, where he was fully known, fully expected, I mean, accepted and fully loved. And I think that when we realize, I know sometimes I have questioned too, like, how on earth are we going to manage in heaven if we don't have marriage? Like, this is going to be crazy. But I think one of the reasons that marriage is so important is because we have someone who knows us intimately, who loves us no matter what, and who serves us and who honors us and who respects us, and we have that one person who like chooses us. And but you know what, when we get to heaven, it's not going to be one person. It's going to be like the essence of where we are. The presence of God is going to envelop us so completely with love that there will actually be no more room for human love, and human love is going to feel like dirty and second rate and gross in comparison to the love. And I think that's what I was experiencing with Scott. He'd experienced God in heaven and his love and what it was like there to be fully known and fully loved. And so this earthly love was just, oh, so pessimistic to him. So I was not discouraged by those words that he gave me. Not discouraged at all. Only encouraged. That as sweet and as wonderful and intimate as our marriage was, and it was, we feel like we had 30 years of worth of intimacy and love in the 14 months and 11 days that we had together. But it was nothing compared to what he had in heaven. So I just want to encourage you, think about heaven. Don't be sad for those who have gone ahead. You can be sad for you. Don't be sad for them. He used to say to me, we'd lay in bed and he'd say to me, "Oh, Carl-Ann, when I die, I'm going to miss you." And I said, "No, you're not. I'm going to miss you, but you're going to be going on and you're going to have a great time and I'll be there soon enough. So you are not going to miss me. And it's okay that you don't. Just, you'll be fine. You're going to have a great time. I'm the one who's going to miss you." And that's the truth. He is not watching over me now. He is living his absolute best life to the fullest potential, more life than he ever had here on earth. And he is engaged in a lot of fun activities, and every work that he puts his hand to is work well done, and it's work that's well accomplished. There's no failure in heaven, and he's going to be learning things and he's going to be able to comprehend them, and it's just going to be like everything he touches is going to be just so full of life and like vitality that he's having a grand time. I don't believe that our loved ones watch us, because that would be very sad for them to watch us cry, for them to watch us blunder around in our lives, making financial mistakes or offending other people. They'd be like, "Oh, no, don't do that." And that's not what heaven's about. But in a blink of an eye, it'll seem so short to them. We're just going to be joining them. And this time on earth might be like 80 years, 90 years. For some, it's 100, very few. But really, in the grand scheme of eternity, that's just a short time. So live for heaven. It's a great place. Like, it is so great. Like, even the best things here on earth are terrible in comparison. So, anyway, there you go. There's my thoughts. And some of you have been saying to me, "Oh, you look like you're doing so well. You're such a strong woman." No. No, I'm not. Um, I am a strong woman only because I have a strong God. I'm not a strong woman. But the truth is, there are some days I stay in bed all day, that I cry. I'm doing my best to take the advice that I give to those I coach, and that is when you're grieving, give yourself rest, give yourself grace. So I cry, I stay home, I don't go places if I feel like I won't have the capacity. And that's a lot of days right now. As a matter of fact, month 2, I'm finding, is a lot harder than month 1. It's hard. Um, I miss him more and more every day. I wouldn't say that I feel strong at all. I feel pretty weak. I feel pretty overwhelmed. Littlest things overwhelm me. Going to the grocery store overwhelms me. I actually, I've only been to the grocery store once, and I don't think I ever want to go back. Um, I normally love going to the beach, but I haven't been able to go to the beach yet this year. I do force myself to go out and do a couple of things. I do force myself to go into some spider rides. Once I'm on the ride, I enjoy it, but just leaving the house is hard. Sometimes just leaving the building to get onto my deck is hard. So I don't want you guys to like look at me and go, "Oh, look how strong she is." No, I am grieving. Um, I cry a lot. I pray a lot. I'm finding lots of encouragement in Psalms. Lots of encouragement in Psalms, and I have some songs that I have on repeat, um, that just help sort of keep me, I guess, focused. I do think about heaven a lot, and this kind of conversation helps me because I can't be sad for him, and it does help me want to long to go there more. It just makes me remember that someday I will be the one who is dying. And right now, I'm not suicidal. So please, I look forward to that day when I can say goodbye to this earth and get to heaven and be in the presence of a God who loves me so insanely much that like the colors will be different and life will be vibrant. That the love that I've experienced here with Scott is like awful in comparison to what I will experience with God. And trust me, what Scott and I had was pretty amazing. So yeah, that sort of holds me up, gets me excited. And yeah, but I really do love talking with you guys. Some of you have sent me messages. I've gone for coffee with some of you, and that's been really kind of fun. I love it when people ask me to tell stories about Scott or to talk about Scott. And if you have a loved one that you're missing, I actually love hearing about those stories too. It helps with the grieving. So, anyway, there you go. Hope you guys are having a great day.